Hey there, Jew. Ready to dive deep into some NestJS security? Let's talk about how to build those layers of protection for your NestJS applications.
That's right. It's about understanding how to use the tools and techniques to make those applications really secure.
Right. And we're going to break down those complex concepts. Make it easy to understand, use real-world examples, maybe throw in some analogies along the way.
Exactly. No push-ups required.
No push-ups. I like that.
All right, let's kick things off with authentication, the gatekeeper of your app. It's all about verifying user identity. Think of it like a digital bouncer, checking those IDs at the door of your application.
Okay. Sounds important. Now, how does NestJS actually handle this?
Well, it uses this really elegant concept called the authentication module.
Authentication module.
Yeah. And you can think of it as the control center for all your security logic.
Okay. And how would we use that in our code?
You'll have services and controllers that work together within that module. You'll typically have a designated sign-in endpoint. That's where the user sends their credentials, typically a username and a password.
Right.
And the system checks against a database of authorized users.
Okay. That makes sense. But I know one of the biggest security no-nos is storing passwords in plain text. It'd be like leaving the keys to your castle right under the welcome mat.
Yeah.
So how does NestJS help us avoid that?
You are spot on. Never store passwords in plain text. It's crucial to use hashing. It's a one-way process, takes that password, turns it into this unreadable jumble of characters.
So even if someone got their hands on our database, all they'd see are these, scrambled password hashes, not the actual passwords themselves.
Exactly. And they can't reverse that hash back into the original password. So even if they stole it, it's pretty much useless.
That's clever. Okay. So we've checked their ID. We've got these super secret hashed passwords. But how do we keep track of that authentication? Like give them a digital stamp of approval or something?
That's where JWTs come in. JSON Web Tokens. Think of them as special access passes your application issues after a successful sign-in.
Okay. So what kind of information do these JWTs hold?
They contain encoded information about the user, things like their ID, maybe their role, all digitally signed, make sure it hasn't been tampered with,
Right.
tucked away in the authorization header of each request, kind of like showing your backstage pass to access different areas of a concert venue.
I like that analogy. Okay, so we've got the authentication piece down. We're making sure only the right people get in.
Yeah.
But there's more to security than just getting past the front door, right? Once they're in, we need to control what they can do within our app.
You're absolutely right. That's where authorization comes in. Who has access to what within your app?
This is like different levels of access, right? Some users have VIP passes, others have general admission.
Exactly. And you can manage this through role-based access control, or RBAC for short.
RBAC.
Yeah, think admin, editor, viewer, each with a set of permissions.
Right, so an admin might be able to delete user accounts while a viewer can only, read content.
Exactly. And NestJS makes this easy to implement using decorators.
Decorators, huh?
Yeah, you add a little snippet of code, like @roles above a controller method, specifies which roles are allowed to access that functionality.
Okay. But what if I want more fine-grained control? Like I want to restrict access to a particular article rather than just any article.
That's a great point. For more nuanced situations, we can use claims-based authorization. Think of it like giving users digital badges, each badge representing a specific permission.
So instead of saying I am an admin, it's like I have a badge to edit this specific article.
Exactly. And you'd enforce these permissions using decorators and guards. There are libraries like CASL, Conditional Authorization System language, that streamline the process of defining and enforcing those authorization rules.
CASL. Wow. It's amazing how flexible NestJS is with all this. But even with authentication and authorization in place, aren't there still some sneaky attacks that could try to, slip through the cracks?
You're right. No system is 100% secure. Two common attacks targeting web applications, including those built with NestJS, are CORS and CSRF.
Core CSRF. Kind of like alphabet soup. Can you break those down for me?
You got it. CORS stands for Cross-Origin Resource Sharing. It's this browser security mechanism that controls how websites from different domains can interact with each other.
Okay. How does that turn into a security risk?
Well, imagine a malicious website trying to make requests to your NestJS application, maybe trying to steal data or hijack a session. CORS is about setting rules for which websites are allowed to interact with your app.
It's like a whitelist of approved websites.
Exactly. And NestJS makes configuring CORS easy.
Okay. That makes sense. Now, what about CSRF? How is that different from CORS?
CSRF, cross-site request forgery, is all about tricking a user into performing an action they didn't intend to, often exploiting their existing logged-in session.
Okay, give me an example. I'm intrigued now.
Imagine you're logged into your bank. You visit a malicious website with hidden code. This code is designed to send a request to your bank, maybe to transfer money to the attacker's account.
Oh no, and because I'm already logged in, the bank just processes that request thinking it's me.
Precisely. CSRF attacks take advantage of that trust between a website and a logged-in user.
That's terrifying.
Yeah.
So how do we protect against CSRF?
NestJS works seamlessly with external libraries that specialize in CSRF protection. A popular option is the CSRF package.
So we install this package, and it'll do its magic within our NestJS app.
It generates and validates these special tokens. It's like an extra layer of security for your forms and requests, like a secret handshake. Make sure the request is coming from a legitimate source.
Okay, a secret handshake. I like that. So we're building this strong security foundation with authentication, authorization, protecting against KRS and CSRF attacks. But we still need to protect the data itself, right? Like the stuff that needs to be kept secret, even if it falls into the wrong hands.
You're talking about encryption and hashing. These are fundamental tools for any security engineer.
Right. Encryption was like putting a message in a secure lockbox, and hashing was like putting it through a blender. Can you remind me which situations call for which method?
You got it. Encryption's used when you need to retrieve the original data later, like storing sensitive user information or sending data securely over a network.
Okay, so encryption is like sending a secret message in code. Only the person with the right key can understand it.
A perfect analogy. Hashing, on the other hand, it's one way. It's perfect for comparing values without needing to see the original data.
So that's why we hash passwords, because we only need to compare them, right? We don't need to actually see the original password.
Exactly. NestJS works perfectly with Node.js's built-in crypto module and powerful libraries like bcrypt for robust hashing, especially for passwords.
Okay, so what would actually using these tools look like in our code?
For encryption, you can use the crypto module. It's a good starting point. But when it comes to passwords, bcrypt is really the gold standard.
Okay.
It uses a strong hashing algorithm and also this thing called salt. Makes those hashes even more resistant to cracking.
Salt, like what we put on our food.
Kind of. It's this random string of characters added to the password before it's hashed. So even if two users have the same password, their hashes will be completely different.
Oh, that's clever. So it's like each password gets its own unique seasoning before it's blended up. Encryption, hashing, are secret weapons for protecting sensitive data. But are there any, like, quick wins, easy ways to boost security in our NestJS applications?
Absolutely. There's a package called Helmet. Think of it like putting a safety helmet on your application, adding layers of protection, and you do it with just a few lines of code.
Helmet, okay. It's not an actual helmet, is it?
No, but it protects your application, so to speak. It's a collection of middleware functions that set those HTTP headers. They're like small bits of information sent with every request and response.
Okay. I always thought HTTP headers were for, like, technical stuff. How do those actually help with security?
They're like powerful signals, you know. They tell browsers how to handle the content and improve the security.
Right.
Like one header Helmet sets is the XXSS protection header. Helps prevent those cross-site scripting attacks.
Right, cross-site scripting. That's where attackers try to sneak malicious scripts onto our web pages.
Exactly. This header tells the browser to be extra cautious, like, hey, double-check everything before running any code.
Okay, good. I feel a little bit safer already.
Yeah.
So Helmet helps with cross-site scripting. What other benefits does it offer?
It helps prevent clickjacking, where attackers try to trick users into clicking things they don't intend to, and it enforces those secure connections using HTTPS. You even get control over the content security policy, dictates which resources are allowed to load.
Wow, that's a lot of protection from just one package. But what if we have someone who's, really determined and keeps trying to brute force their way into our app, relentlessly guessing passwords or just hammering the server with requests?
You're describing a brute force attack. That's where rate limiting comes in handy.
Rate limits.
Yeah. It's about setting limits on how often a user can make requests.
So they can't just overwhelm the system.
Exactly. NestJS makes this simple with a package called @NestJS It's like a bouncer who's like, hey, whoa, one request at a time.
Okay, so if a user makes too many requests too quickly, they get a temporary timeout.
Exactly. Or even a permanent block, depending on how you configure it.
Okay, so we can control that flow of traffic, stop those attacks in their tracks.
Yeah.
But can we get more granular with rate limiting? Like, how do we handle things like WebSockets or APIs?
You're thinking ahead. And yes, absolutely you can.
Okay.
For instance, you could use Redis, which is a shared storage, ensures consistent rate limiting across multiple servers, which is crucial in a distributed system.
Okay, so no matter which server they hit, those rate limits apply.
Exactly. And for WebSockets, you can actually extend the throttler guard to handle those persistent connections used for real-time communication.
That's amazing. It's like having a whole security team at our fingertips. But you mentioned earlier, no system is perfectly secure. So how do we actually test the security of our NestJS applications? Make sure all these defenses are working as they should.
That's an excellent point. Testing is essential, like setting up a sophisticated alarm system and never checking if the siren actually works. In the software world, we have different levels of testing to make sure those security measures are up to par.
So what are some of those testing techniques? Do we need to hire, like, ethical hackers to try to break into our app?
Penetration testing with ethical hackers is definitely valuable, but that's often later in the development cycle. We can do a lot during the development phase to catch those potential issues early on.
So what's the first line of defense?
Unit testing. Writing tests that target specific parts of your code, like your authentication, your authorization logic.
Unit testing, right? That's where we write code to test our code.
Exactly.
It's like giving our functions a little interrogation.
You got it. In NestJS, we can leverage frameworks like Jeth to write those unit tests.
Okay.
Verify things like whether passwords are being hashed correctly, JWTs are generated and validated properly, whether those authorization guards are blocking unauthorized access.
So we're simulating both good and bad behavior, seeing how those defenses hold up. But unit testing is focused on small parts, right? What about testing how everything works together, like a user logging in, accessing a protected resource, and then logging out?
That's where end-to-end testing shines. It's like simulating an actual user interacting with your application.
So we write tests that would launch a browser, navigate through the app, filling out forms, clicking buttons.
Exactly. During those tests, we check if the authentication flow is working smoothly, the authorization rules are being enforced, that sensitive data is handled securely.
It sounds really thorough. Are there tools commonly used for this in NestJS?
Cypress. Powerful and user-friendly, allows interaction with your app in a real browser environment.
Cypress. Okay, heard good things. Are there other testing techniques beyond unit and end-to-end testing?
Security scanning is gaining traction. It uses automated tools to analyze your code for potential weaknesses.
Security scanning. Sounds intense.
Think of it like an automated security consultant giving your code a checkup.
Okay,
There are open source and commercial tools that can scan your code. Look for things like common coding errors, outdated dependencies, configuration issues.
it's like having a digital bloodhound sniff out those weaknesses in our code.
Precisely. And many of these tools can be integrated into your development workflow.
So we're catching those vulnerabilities early, even before they make it to production.
Exactly.
This is fantastic. We're building an entire security testing arsenal. But is there an order in which we should approach these testing techniques?
Yeah.
Like, do we start with unit testing, move on to end-to-end, and then finish with security scanning?
That's a great question. And the answer, like so many things in software development, is it depends.
Classic, it depends. So no one-size-fits-all approach.
Not really. Generally, unit testing should be your foundation. Make sure those individual building blocks are secure. Then, as your application grows, you layer on end-to-end tests. See how it all works together.
And then security scanning could be done periodically as part of our deployment process.
Exactly. You get this regular security audit. But remember, your approach will depend on your application, your development process, and your overall risk tolerance.
This has been amazing. We've covered so much ground: authentication, authorization, guarding against those attacks, encryption, hashing, rate limiting.
We've got a whole security toolkit now.
We do.
Yep.
And it's not even over yet. There's even more to explore.
Yeah, like newer authentication methods, securing our APIs, lots more to talk about.
Absolutely.
You know, we've talked about the traditional username and password approach, and we touched on those powerful JWTs.
Right.
But there's this whole world of newer authentication methods out there, things like social login, even passwordless authentication. Where does NestJS stand with those?
Yeah, you're right. I use social login all the time, clicking that login with Google or login with Facebook button. And
Right.
it's just so convenient. How do we bring that kind of functionality into our NestJS applications?
It all starts with OAuth 2.0.
OAuth 2.0.
Yeah, it's an industry standard protocol for authorization.
Yeah.
It's like your app saying to a service like Google, hey, can you vouch for this user?
So we're outsourcing the authentication to a trusted third party.
That's the idea.
Hmm.
And from a security standpoint, it's great. You don't have to store those passwords. There's a little bit of back and forth involved, redirects, token exchanges. When a user clicks the Login with Google button, your NestJS app redirects them over to Google's authentication server.
Okay.
Right.
So it's like a quick detour to Google's security checkpoint.
Exactly. If the user gives okay, Google sends them back to your app with this authorization code.
Okay. So it's like a temporary pass.
Yeah,
Uh,
a temporary pass that you can trade in for something more permanent, which is the access token.
Right.
And your app can then use that access token to actually get user data from Google.
Okay. So we grab that user's info, like their email address, and use that to like create a session in our app.
Exactly. And then, business as usual. You can use techniques like JWTs, manage that user session within your app.
Okay. That's great. So social login streamlines the user experience, keeps security tight.
Yeah.
But what about this passwordless authentication I keep hearing about? Is that for real? Can we really log in without a password?
Oh, it's definitely real, and it's becoming more and more popular.
Okay.
The idea is to ditch passwords completely,
Okay.
which, let's be honest, passwords can be kind of a pain.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've definitely had my share of forgotten passwords, those password reset headaches. So how does passwordless authentication work? Is it just like smoke and mirrors?
Not at all. One common approach uses these things called magic links.
Magic links.
Yeah. The user enters their email address, and the system sends them a unique link. That link gives them direct access to the app.
So it's like a temporary key delivered straight to your inbox.
Precisely. These links are typically time-sensitive, can only be used once, which adds an extra layer of security.
Right.
And no more remembering complex passwords.
I love it. Okay, but are magic links the only way to do passwordless authentication?
No, not at all. Another popular method uses one-time passwords, OTPs.
OTPs, like those 6-digit codes you get when you're trying to verify your identity online.
Exactly. The user provides their email or phone number, and the system just generates this unique OTP, sends it to them.
Okay.
They enter that code to authenticate. Think of it like supercharged two-factor authentication. That second factor is just generated on the fly.
Passwordless authentication. That sounds like the future of logging in. Can we actually implement these cool approaches in NestJS? Does it have like built-in support, or are we going to need to get creative with custom code?
NestJS, being the flexible framework that it is, doesn't box you into any specific methods. You can use its core features and integrate with third-party libraries or services. Build out passwordless auth however you need.
Okay. So maybe a little coding wizardry might be required, but the payoff seems worth it. A smoother, more secure login experience.
Absolutely, especially considering all the headaches passwords can cause. But let's switch gears a bit. Talk about APIs. A lot of our NestJS applications power these behind-the-scenes APIs. They're handling sensitive data, performing those critical operations. What kind of special considerations do we need to keep in mind when we're securing our NestJS APIs?
Yeah, that's a great point. APIs are like gateways to our systems. Their security is super important. Is it the same set of challenges as securing a regular web application, or do APIs have their own unique vulnerabilities?
There are definitely some similarities, but APIs bring their own set of challenges.
Okay.
For example, injection attacks are a huge concern.
Injection attacks.
Yeah. Think of it like this. Malicious data is sent to the API, potentially allowing attackers to execute code or gain access to information they shouldn't have.
So it's like sneaking something harmful into a system that's not supposed to be there.
Right. And because APIs often rely on structured data, JSON, XML, they can be prime targets for these kinds of attacks.
Okay. So how do we protect against those injection attacks? Is it about sanitizing input, escaping special characters, the same stuff we do for web applications?
Sanitizing and escaping are important, but with APIs, you really need to go a step further. Input validation is a powerful technique. It's about defining the specific rules for what data your API will accept.
Okay, so we're creating a blueprint for good data, and anything that doesn't match that blueprint is just rejected.
Exactly. This is crucial for stopping malicious data from slipping through and potentially exploiting vulnerabilities. NestJS even has tools like Class Validator, which make defining those data schemas and validation rules much easier.
It's like having a built-in security guard for our API. But what about authentication and authorization? Are those just as important for APIs as they are for web apps?
Even more so, I'd say. APIs are accessed by all sorts of clients, mobile apps, integrations, other systems. You need to be sure that only authorized clients can access the API, and then within that, they can only perform the actions they are permitted to.
So it's like multiple layers of security with ID checks, access cards, maybe even some biometric scanners for good measure.
Exactly. And the great thing about NestJS is that it gives you those tools to build that robust auth and authorization into your APIs.
Okay, so we can use the same authentication methods we talked about before, like JWTs, social login, to verify those API clients.
You got it. And when it comes to authorization, you can use role-based access control or even more fine-grained permission systems. Control what each client can do.
Okay. It's amazing how we can use the same building blocks for web apps and APIs.
Yeah.
But some attackers are pretty persistent, right? Couldn't they still try to probe our API for weaknesses, like trying to guess endpoints or figuring out how the data is structured?
You're absolutely right. Attackers are always looking for an edge. Reconnaissance is a tactic they commonly use. It's like digital spies sneaking around.
Reconnaissance?
Yeah, trying to map out the structure of your API, find any weaknesses.
That sounds a little bit scary.
Yeah.
So what can we do to make our NestJS APIs tougher against reconnaissance attempts? Do we need to, like, go completely stealth mode?
Going invisible would be great, but not very practical.
Yeah.
But there are definitely steps you can take to make reconnaissance much harder.
Okay.
One technique is to limit the amount of information your API reveals in error messages.
So instead of giving away too much detail about how things work internally, we give more generic responses.
Exactly. You don't want to give attackers any clues. It's like playing poker. Keep your cards close.
Right. Don't give away more information than you have to. Are there other ways to make our API structure, less obvious to prying eyes?
Yeah, you can try to obscure the structure a bit, make it harder to guess endpoints or understand how that data is organized. The idea is to be unpredictable.
Okay, so how do we do that?
Well, for starters, avoid using predictable URL patterns for your endpoints.
Right.
Instead of users or products, use more unique, less obvious names.
So be more creative with our naming conventions.
Exactly. You can also use versioning in your URLs,
Okay.
like V4 users, V2 products.
Right.
It obscures the structure, helps deprecate older versions securely.
Versioning. Yeah, that makes sense. It's like putting up a new facade on the API. Makes it harder for attackers to find those entry points.
Precisely. And these are just a couple of ideas. It's really about trying to think like an attacker, anticipate their moves, and make it as hard as possible for them to get any kind of foothold.
This whole conversation about API security has been really eye-opening. It's definitely a different mindset compared to securing regular web applications, but I feel a lot more confident now.
That's great. Remember, like all aspects of security, it's a continuous process. As technology changes and new threats pop up, we need to stay vigilant and be ready to adapt.
Okay, and speaking of adapting, one area where the human element comes into play is, the role of the developers themselves. Even with the best security systems, human error can sometimes slip through. What are some common security missteps developers make,
Yeah.
and how can we, try to avoid them?
You're absolutely right. Human error is a factor we can't eliminate entirely.
Right.
And it's not always the big, obvious mistakes,
Right.
like forgetting to hash passwords or exposing data. It's often those more subtle things that can trip us up.
Okay, like what? What are some examples of those subtler slip-ups?
Think about using weak passwords or reusing the same password across different accounts. People still do that. Or falling victim to phishing attacks, those sneaky emails.
Right, so it's not just about technical stuff. It's also about raising awareness. Good security practices among the developers.
Exactly. Security is everyone's responsibility.
Right.
You need to create this culture of security within development teams.
A culture of security. Okay, but how do we actually do that? Do we have to have mandatory security training, hand out security badges, decoder rings, things like that?
Those are all great ideas, but it's also about fostering open communication,
Okay.
encouraging devs to ask questions, making those resources available, security best practices. Make security a collaborative thing, not a burden or a set of rules.
Right. Make it part of the conversation.
Yeah.
But are there things we can do within our NestJS projects to help devs write more secure code? Like tools or libraries that prevent mistakes?
Oh, absolutely. That's one of the great things about NestJS. Right out of the box, it encourages conventions, best practices.
Okay.
And by using those features and the recommended libraries, we can kind of nudge developers towards those more secure coding patterns.
Can you give some specific examples? What are some of those NestJS features that really help with secure coding?
Dependency injection is a fantastic one.
Dependency injection, right.
Encourages devs to inject dependencies rather than hard coding them. Makes the code more modular, more testable, but it also makes it harder to accidentally expose or modify sensitive information.
Okay.
Right.
Dependency injection, that's where we're like providing dependencies from outside the class instead of creating them directly inside.
Exactly. Another great example is the module system in NestJS.
Okay.
It helps organize code into well-defined modules. Clear boundaries, clear responsibilities.
Right. Modules are like those self-contained units of code that handle a specific part of our app.
Exactly. And by keeping those modules organized and focused, we can actually reduce the attack surface.
It's like we're dividing our castle into smaller sections, each with its own defenses.
Precisely. And then, we can look outside NestJS core features. There are external libraries and tools that can help.
Okay.
Like linters, for instance.
Linters, okay.
They analyze your code for common security issues.
Right. Linters are like code critics, right?
Right.
Pointing out those potential problems.
Think of them as automated code reviewers, always on the lookout for bad practices or potential flaws. And then there are those security scanning tools. They patrol your code base, constantly searching for signs of trouble.
No.
Identify those vulnerabilities.
So it's like having a built-in security team, part of our development process.
Exactly.
But even with all these tools, it's important to remember that security isn't just about the tech. It's about the people, too. We need to create that culture of security where developers feel empowered to build secure software.
Absolutely. The best way to empower them is to give them the knowledge, the tools, and the support they need to make good security decisions.
So it's not just about telling them what to do, but giving them the context and the understanding to make the right choices.
Exactly. And that's how we can build NestJS applications that are not only powerful, but also secure.
Wow, we've covered a ton of ground here. Authentication, authorization, input validation, encryption, hashing, helmet, rate limiting. It's a lot. But how do we take all these amazing tools and actually use them effectively in our NestJS projects? It's easy to feel a bit overwhelmed.
You're absolutely right. It's not about just throwing every security measure at your project and hoping for the best. You got to be strategic, like with any good software design.
So it's about thinking things through, being deliberate, not just adding security as an afterthought.
Exactly. You need to understand the why behind each security measure. What are you protecting and who are you protecting it from?
Right, because a small internal tool is going to have different security needs than a huge public-facing app with tons of sensitive data. So how do we figure out the right level of security for our specific application?
There are industry standards and best practices you can look to, like the OAuth POP 10. It highlights those common web application security risks.
OWASP, yeah, I've heard of them. It's like a global group of security experts, right? Always looking out for new threats.
Precisely. They provide great resources and guidance. But beyond those general guidelines, you also need to consider your application's specific context.
So some introspection is needed. What kind of questions should we be asking ourselves?
Well, for starters, what kind of data does your app handle? How sensitive is it? Who are the potential users, internal, external? And what could happen if there was a security breach? Financial losses, damage to your reputation, legal issues.
Wow, those are some serious questions. Makes you realize that security is about more than just the technology. It's about managing risk, understanding the potential impact.
Absolutely. And once you have a good grasp of your security goals and your risk tolerance, then you can start putting together your security strategy, choosing the right tools for the job.
Okay, so we've assessed those risks, defined our goals. Now we're ready to get our hands dirty and start implementing. What are those essential building blocks of a secure NestJS app? Give us the rundown.
Well, we've touched on many of them already. But just to recap those key areas: authentication, making sure you know who your users are. Use strong methods like JWTs, maybe social login, even those passwordless options we discussed.
Right, checking those digital IDs at the door.
Then authorization, controlling what each user can do within your app. RBAC is a great place to start, but you can get more fine-grained if needed.
Making sure they have the right access passes, so to speak.
Next, input validation. Sanitize and validate all incoming data, no matter where it comes from.
Our strict customs inspectors are hard at work.
Exactly. Don't forget about error handling. Be mindful of how much info you reveal in those messages.
Right, keep those cards close to the chest. Anything else?
Those HTTP headers we talked about, especially with Helmet, offer quick and easy protection. And then, of course, rate limiting, our bouncer at the door, making sure the system isn't overwhelmed.
Rate limiting, gotta have that.
Yeah.
But even with all these things in place, security isn't a one-time thing, is it? It's an ongoing process.
You got it. Think of those old castles. They were always being reinforced and upgraded to withstand those new threats. That's the mindset we need with software security.
We can't just set it and forget it.
Definitely not. The threats are always changing, new vulnerabilities pop up, so we need to stay informed, keep our tools updated, and be ready to adapt.
It's like a constant arms race.
Yeah.
But instead of weapons, we're using knowledge and code.
Yeah.
How do we keep up with it all?
Well, the good news is you're not alone. The NestJS community is a fantastic resource. Forums, blogs, conferences, all sorts of places to connect, share knowledge, learn from each other's experiences.
Like we're all allies, working together to strengthen those defenses.
Exactly. And you have organizations like OAuth doing research and publishing guidance.
Wow. So much information and support out there. This has been a fantastic deep dive. I feel way more equipped to build truly secure NestJS applications.
That's great to hear. Remember, security is a journey, not a destination. By staying informed, using best practices, and building that culture of security, you can create apps that are not only powerful, but safe and trustworthy.
Great way to put it. And a huge thank you to our expert for all this amazing information.
My pleasure.
And to everyone listening, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into NestJS security. Go build amazing things. And remember, security is a shared responsibility. We can make the digital world a safer place together.